Welcome back to the Midwest Minute. I'm your host, Ross Thompson, and today I got a good one for you because we're going to be going over Operation Epic Fury and the Iran War. Back in February, when the US and Israel opened this war, there was a pretty clear list of what winning was supposed to look like. Nuclear program gone, missiles gone, navy gone, proxies contained, regime changed, and shipping lanes protected as a natural byproduct of all of that. Now, 5 months later, I want to actually hold this war up against that list, goal by goal, and be honest about which of those actually happened. Because I think what you'll find is that this war has quietly turned into something almost nobody was talking about back in February. A fight over two narrow strips of water. Let's go through it. But before I begin, please like, share, subscribe to this YouTube or whatever streaming platform you're watching this on, as well as look at my website, midwestminute.net, where I post all my videos, short form blogs on there, as well as my Facebook and X, which is also Midwest Minute. Hit the bell so you never miss any future episodes, because I'm just keep ramping things up. Gonna give it a go. Go Max. All right, the first goal: stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. This was the headline justification from day one, and it's still one of the most people assume is the real reason for this war. Iran's Natanz nuclear facility took direct hits in the opening weeks of the campaign alongside the broader strikes of military infrastructure. But here's what doesn't get said enough: the actual current status of Iran's nuclear program. How much was destroyed, what survived, whether Iran retains any weapons, capable, material, or expertise was never resolved militarily. It got kicked into the ceasefire negotiations back in June as one of the deferred issues in that 60-day framework, and those talks are stalled right now, with Iran refusing to even sit down with U.S. representatives. So this goal doesn't get a clean grade. It's not destroyed, it's unresolved, and now stuck in diplomatic limbo, which is very different than what was promised. Because before the war, Iran let in the IAEA inspectors, which inspected the uranium extraction for nuclear capability. Now, ever since our, Midnight Fury last year, in the June timeframe, all those inspectors have been kicked out. And so now we are in complete blindness on what their nuclear capabilities are. And even if we can destroy new facilities deep into their mountains. The second goal was to destroy Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran opened this war firing roughly 170 ballistic missiles at Israel and Gulf states in the first exchange alone. That tells you the scale of the arsenal we're talking about and the reason we're even having this conversation right now. In late July, is that the fighting never actually stopped. We're currently on what's being reported as the 13th consecutive day of renewed U.S. strikes against Iran. This latest round kicked off after attacks on 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. blamed on Iran and responded to with what CENTCOM called strikes meant to impose heavy costs. If the missile program had actually been destroyed back in the spring, we wouldn't be watching a fresh 2-week stretch of exchanges break out again in July. Whatever was destroyed early on, Iran clearly retained enough capability to keep this cycle going 5 months in. Not only do they have a lot of missiles, they have a lot of drones. Drones are their key factor in keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed currently. Goal 3, destroy Iran's navy. This is generally the strongest case for a win among the 6. 19 Iranian ships were sunk over the course of the war, including the submarine IRIS Fatah. That's a serious blow to any conventional naval capability Iran had. But here's the catch: Iran didn't need a functioning navy to keep causing havoc in the Strait of Hormuz. Mines, harassment of tankers, and targeting commercial vessels are asymmetric tactics. You don't need warships to plant a mine or intercept an oil tanker. So even with this conventional navy gutted, Iran still has had no trouble making the strait dangerous and unpredictable, which is exactly what we're seeing play out right now. Goal number 4: contain Iran's proxies. I'd argue this is the clearest failure of the 6, and maybe the most consequential one. The moment Khamenei was killed in the opening strike, Hezbollah declared war on Israel and opened an entirely separate front in Lebanon. That conflict alone has displaced roughly 700,000 people, which is a humanitarian crisis running in parallel to the main war, which is not a contained proxy. And then there's the Houthis in Yemen. This isn't new behavior for them. During the Israel-Hamas war, the Houthis targeted over 100 vessels in the Red Sea as a pressure tactic. So when I tell you they've now announced a new maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia, we'll get into the specifics in a minute. That's not some random escalation. That's a group that has proven playbook for exactly this kind of disruption deployed again. Added Iran aligned militias operating in Iraq, and you've got a proxy network that is, if anything, more active across more fronts now than what it was before the war started. Contained is not the word I would be using. Regime change in Iran was the 5th goal. This is the one I think deserves the most unpacking, because what actually happened here's almost the opposite of what regime change was supposed to mean. Yeah, we killed Khamenei in the opening strike, but look at what happened next. Iran's assembly of experts elected his own son as the new supreme leader, and he took office that same day despite being injured in the same strike that killed his father. Think about what actually that represents. Iran's system was never supposed to be hereditary. That's not how the Islamic Republic succession was designated to work, and it goes against principles both Khomeinis had publicly supported in the past. But reporting indicates the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, actively pressured the Assembly of Experts to elect his son, and by every account, he is more hardline than his father was, with close ties to the most ideologically extreme clerics in the country, and deep roots in the IRGC going back to when he took control of the militia back in 2009. So walk through the actual outcome. The strike killed a man at the top, and what replaced him wasn't a new government, wasn't an oppositional figure, wasn't a moderate reformer. It was his own son, installed through military pressure, who was more extreme than the guy we killed. If the goal was regime change, what we got was harder, more entrenched version of the same regime, now with a dynastic succession precedent that didn't exist before. That's not a win. That's arguably the opposite of the intended outcome. And we saw this from before the war. Trump, as well as other cabinet officials, say we want a ground up war, not a top down. We want to supply the Iranians with guns and money so they can revolt against our government. Well, when the time came, we didn't see any of that. And now what? Like I just said, we have a more entrenched regime since then, with a lot of radicalized countrymen. Goal 6 was to protect shipping and energy infrastructure. And this brings us to the goal that was supposed to be the easiest. Background 1, protecting shipping was framed as a natural side effect of winning the war, not something that needed its own separate campaign. Instead, it became the entire war. And that's getting how. The pivot. Here's where I want you to really sit with the numbers because I think this is the part of the story that's generally undercovered. Strait of Hormuz transits. Remember when this is the main artery for the Gulf oil heading out there to the rest of the world? Have collapsed. In just 1 week this month, transits dropped to 78 ships, down from 174 the week before. That's more than a 50% drop in 7 days. Eastbound traffic alone fell from 101 down to 44. An analysis are now saying passage through the strait could stay below half of pre-war levels for months because Iran doesn't need a navy to keep enforcing that kind of uncertainty. Mines and intercepted tankers do the trick. Oil markets are already pricing this in. Brent crude jumped more than 3% recently, hitting its highest level since late June, specifically because the U.S. launched fresh strikes after attacks on the 3 commercial vessels in the strait. And on the top of that, the U.S. Treasury revoked a 60-day waiver that had allowed some Iranian oil sales, cutting off that authorization immediately. So you've got military escalation and financial escalation hitting the oil market at the exact same time. And now this week, there's a second front opening in a completely different waterway. The Houthis have announced a maritime embargo specifically targeting Saudi Arabia. In direct retaliation for a Saudi airstrike on the airport in Sana'a. Their military spokesman described it in his own words as an eye for an eye. They've already claimed strikes on at least 2 tankers since making that announcement. And remember, this is a group with an actual track record here, having hit more than 100 vessels during the Gaza war. This isn't an empty threat. Here's why this specific move is so strategically pointed. Saudi Arabia built its east-west pipeline specifically to move oil to the Red Sea, oil to the Red Sea, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz entirely. It was their insurance policy against the Hormuz chaos we just talked about. The Houthis targeting Saudi Arabia shipping in the Red Sea threatens that exact workaround. In other words, the alternate route built to avoid one choke point is now under that exact form by a different actor in an entirely different body of water. So zoom all the way out. A war that began with a list of goals about nuclear weapons, missile programs, toppling a government, has 5 months in turned into something being fought and measured in shipping, manifests, and barrel prices across 2 different waterways, neither of which is secure at the time being. The 60-day negotiation window from the June ceasefire memorandum is running out with the core issues. Sanction relief, Iran's frozen assets, the actual nuclear question, still unresolved. Direct talks are stalled, and now you've got Hezbollah's front in Lebanon, the Houthis' new front in the Red Sea, and still active Hormuz standoff, all running on separate tracks that don't seem to sync up with whatever Washington and Tehran might eventually agree to on paper. So, out of the 6 original war goals, maybe one, the naval campaign, comes close to a clean success. Everything else is either unresolved, actively backfiring, or has been completely overtaken by a fight over 2 waterways nobody was talking about back in February. And this is really what you need to understand on the timeline for this war. Excuse me. We have, I think it was 20% less oil, or I think it was 20 million barrels of oil, I think a day maybe, being pumped out of, that has been stopped being pumped out of the Strait of Hormuz since this war began. Now, where do we get all this oil? Well, Europe, as well as the United States and China, we have all opened our strategic reserves of oil. Means our stockpile that we've been building up for emergencies, we're using some to relieve some of the damage the closure of the strait has been causing. Now what we're seeing is we're seeing reports of these oil reserves are being drained and they cannot sustain much longer. So we're really in a predicament where we're running out of energy in a time where energy is the most important thing, the most important commodity in the world right now when we talk about data centers being built all around the United States, or power grid being at the weakest point, which might honestly lead us to a pivot of nuclear energy, which will probably eventually be the future of the United States. But we're still on a course where we need to get the strait open. And let's say the strait is open. We get it open with 100% guarantee that ships won't get hit in the strait or in the Red Sea. There still is a couple month lag from when we get the strait open to when we get up to 100% levels pre-war. So, and we're heading into the winter months where Europe largely depends on a lot of this oil to heat their cities. So we're looking at a very unprecedented time for the history of the world, really. And I'll leave it on really is don't listen to what Trump is saying. Just look at what they're doing. Okay, I don't know how many times, if I had a nickel for every time Trump said they're begging for a deal, I'd be rich. They're, Iran is begging for a deal. They want to make a deal so bad. Well, that's what you're saying, but when I'm looking at what they're doing and what the United States is doing is two very completely different things. And that's really what a lot of politics is. And there's a lot of speculation where the Trump administration is saying, we don't need the Strait of Hormuz open, or, we're 1 week away from getting a peace deal to artificially boost the crude oil price in a positive direction for consumers. Whereas in reality, that case is not entirely true. So this is just all things to keep an eye on. I do found it really interesting, the contrast of all the goals and how the goals switch from, nuclear regime change, things like that, to now it's completely, we've conceded all of those points of saying, okay, yeah, no, we actually really can't do that. And now we're at a position to where our main focus is just getting the economy back on track and opening up the Strait of Hormuz, which, there's really no other way of putting it as a complete miscalculation on strategy that came out of the Trump administration. Because think of the time we were in before we started this war back in February on the 28th, Operation Epic Fury. We just had a couple-hour war mission, a one-day mission, into Venezuela, where we captured Maduro and his wife with 0 casualties, really 0 repercussions on the U.S. side, and we basically took control of Venezuela, where we can argue whether that regime was officially changed or what's fully going on there, but we kind of took control of their oil reserves, which they have a lot of, but not enough to supplement the loss in the strait. So we take Trump's ego here and we say, okay, we went into Venezuela, with extreme shock and awe. One day, 0 casualties, got the mission done. That might have been, something they were calculating in Iran, where, okay, we go in, we kill Khomeini, the shock and awe force, and they kind of topple over, and the Iranian people, rise up and do the task where we don't have to deploy ground forces. Now it's just not the case. It never was going to be the case because two completely different countries. Iran has a 1 million-man army that's spread out with multiple leaders, and a lot of boomers are calling, well, not just boomers, but people are calling, just finish the job, just go in and bomb them to smithereens, bomb Iran to smithereens. And really it comes down to is we really can't. We start bombing them, we start bombing their civilian infrastructure. What are they going to do? We can't get all their launch sites at once. They're going to start launching into civilian infrastructure in the Gulf Coast, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates. And now we're at a full-blown Middle East war where, the desalination plants are getting hit on all these Gulf countries, and it's just bitter chaos where these Gulf countries can't afford that. The United States can't afford that. So it's not really just as easy as going in and bombing them, because we can bomb, but then what are we going to do? Like, they're so entrenched that we'd either need a nuke, which is off the option, well, maybe not completely off the plate for Trump, but it should be, or a ground invasion, whether it just be to take Karg Island or further, which you'd almost have to think is kind of off the option too for Trump with his ego. He does that and his legacy is more tarnished than what it already is. So those are really the only options. And frankly, we are running out of money. I think like a month ago, Hegseth said, war's going good, got the funds, everything's going good. And now this past week, he's begging Congress for more money for the war. And that's really what it comes down to, is not watching what they say, really watch what they do, where they plead from. And it takes time to build all the missiles. So if we're sending over missiles that are worth millions of dollars and they're shooting them down and recovering with missiles that are worth $1,000, well, it doesn't take quick, to figure out that gap and really who it's hurting more. There's a lot more escalation we could be doing, and where it sits right now is, okay, Trump and the military is threatened that if they one tack on a commercial ship, we're going to attack one time on a bridge or a civilian infrastructure plant. So they attack one ship, one missile to a ship or what have you. We're going to send one missile, blow up a bridge or other infrastructure. Well, then Iran responded with, okay, you blow up one of our bridges, we're going to blow up an infrastructure in a Gulf Coast. That's where I was getting at. This goal is, if we just blanket, carpet bomb them, besides all the innocent lives that were destroyed, they're also going to retaliate to all these Gulf countries, which are our allies. So we're really in a sticky situation here, to where maybe the only option is just to, put our tail underneath us and run, because when you war game this, nothing really is, there really is no win anymore. Like I don't think there ever will be a win, especially when we have our ally Israel. They have their own goals and their own front in Lebanon, when that's a very key factor in Iran's decision for peace. They want Israel to stop bombing Lebanon, and Israel just can't help themselves, so they won't. So we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. And so it's been interesting to watch this whole entire escalation unfold. And literally, it's cool just when you watch the news, just listen to what Trump is saying. How bad they want to make a deal. And at one point, Trump said, no, the polls, 60% of people, oppose ending this war and support the memorandum of understanding. And then now that we're bombing them, he says, it's 70% of people support, taking out Iran. It's like, okay, which one is it? You know, do people want the war to end or do people want the war to continue? Because, you know, when you add that up, you know, there's not 130% people in America. So do you think this ends in actual resolution, or are we just watching a slow motion economic war with no real finish line? Let me know in the comments. Email me. Let me know what your thoughts are and what do you want me to do next. Sorry for the ums. Follow, like, subscribe, follow, hit the bell. Find me on Facebook, Midwest Minute. A lot more content will be on there starting soon. But until then, stay curious.